Ladies and gentlemen, I'd now like to extend the warmest of welcomes to Marc Francois. I can't believe it's less than 18 months since Marc first addressed the Bruges Group. In those days, he was a quiet, almost circumspect figure. But I'm glad to see that as the months have gone by, he's become more robust and forthright in his views. But ladies and gentlemen, I jest. Marc always has been the robustious and colourful figure that defeated Boris Johnson and became the parliamentary candidate for the Rayleigh constituency some 20 years ago. But indeed, ladies and gentlemen, there's another side to Marc Francois. Many of us were not happy with the agreement that Boris brought back from Brussels. And I know that Marc and many of his colleagues also had reservations. However, over the last 3 or 4 months, Marc and others have been working tirelessly behind the scenes to secure improvements. The final withdrawal bill, represented in the new year, was a materially better piece of legislation than that was put before the previous Parliament and not enacted. The negotiating strategy and objectives that the government has set out for David Frost in his discussions with Michel Barnier over the next few months are also much more robust than anything we have seen before from a Conservative government. So many thanks to Marc and his colleagues for what they have achieved behind the scenes. But I would also like them to take back this message from our conference today. Please, please don't give up. The finishing line may be in sight, but every effort still needs to be made to ensure we have an outcome which means that the talents of the British people in the decades to come will be released for the benefit of all. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Marc Francois MP.
Mr. Chairman, my parliamentary colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is an absolute pleasure to be addressing the Bruges Group again this weekend in my normal humble and shy way. It is true that I defeated Boris Johnson to be chosen as the Conservative candidate for Rayleigh in 2000 and was then elected in 2001. I reminded him of this 2 or 3 times down the years. So I'm not going to be in the government anytime soon. I will apologise up front. Unfortunately, I have another event in Upminster at 4 o'clock. So when I finish speaking with the agreement of the chair, and I hope if you'll allow me, I'm going to shoot off fairly promptly, but that's no disrespect to Andrew or Shankar or any of you. It's just the busy life of a Member of Parliament. But after many years, I have good news to report. Ladies and gentlemen, at last, finally, we are living in a free country. I suspect many of you celebrated in your own way on the night, legally I hope, and I went to 3 different parties. Got a couple of hours sleep, and then my partner Olivia, who's here today, and I went up onto Parliament Hill and watched the sunrise at dawn. I will never ever forget seeing the sunrise and knowing we were free. And all my colleagues in the ERG, including my great fellow Spartans, Sybil, Cash and Andrea. All we've ever wanted for so many years is the right to live in a free country that elects its own government, that makes its own laws, and then lives under them in peace. That's exactly what I told your colleagues at the Conservative Party conference last autumn, and I'm delighted to report that that prospect has now become an actual reality. I did also say last autumn, light-heartedly, that I wasn't going to buy David Cameron's book because I wasn't in it. If I can set the record straight, I have now purchased the book, and it's good. And I say that because I'm now writing one of my own, which will be called You Really Couldn't Make It Up, about my life and particularly the events of the last few years. And of course I will be expecting Mr. Cameron to reciprocate. But while I'm here, I would also like to thank all of you in the Bruges Group, all of you, Barry, Sir Ivan, everybody, Robert, the lot of you, for everything you've done ever since Margaret Thatcher's famous speech in 1988 to help make this eventual outcome one that liberated our nation. I think you deserve to give yourselves a round of applause. Now, it took us over 3 years of parliamentary trench warfare and 2 general elections to get us to this point. The last one resulting in a thumping majority of 80, which finally allowed us to get Brexit done. So now we're faced with the trade negotiations that follow. Remember, as part of the withdrawal agreement that we signed with the EU prior to the 31st of January, we also signed a political declaration which committed both sides to negotiating a comprehensive free trade agreement, an FTA, by the end of 2020. As the chairman of the European Research Group, and I pay tribute to my predecessor Steve Baker, a brilliant leader of the group without whom we arguably would never have left the European Union. I'm quietly confident that we will succeed in successfully negotiating a deal which will allow us to trade equitably with the European Union, and that we'll get that deal by the end of the year. And I say that for 4 reasons. Firstly, because the political declaration, which in effect lays down the tram lines, as it were, within which the negotiations must take place, has already specified a free trade agreement as the desired outcome. In other words, both sides have already agreed in principle where they want the final talks to land, and it's now a question of agreeing the specific details of the arrangement. Theresa May's variant of the withdrawal agreement did not have this proviso, but instead it committed us to a Chequers-style outcome in which we would be very closely aligned to the EU's rules and regulations. The truth is that the Prime Minister played something of a blinder in persuading the EU to drop that commitment and to opt for an FTA in the revised political declaration instead, something that we as Brexiteers have been arguing for a number of years. That was no small feat. Secondly, our opening position as the UK is essentially that we would like a Canadian-style FTA similar to the EU-Canadian agreement which the European Union signed in 2016. This is, ironically, what Michel Barnier, the EU's chief negotiator, was offering us in principle some 2 years ago, but now that we've accepted it, for reasons best known to themselves, the EU is saying that this could be quite difficult. Some critics point out that the EU-Canadian deal took 7 years to negotiate, and this is true. However, the flip side of this is that all of the heavy lifting has already been done, and many of the most knotty issues have already been resolved. Therefore, we begin these negotiations not with a blank piece of paper, but based on an existing precedent to which the EU has already agreed. Common sense suggests this must make it easier to come to an agreement than if we started completely from scratch. Thirdly, when the Prime Minister said last year he would persuade the EU to drop the dreaded backstop, i.e. participation in a customs union, from the withdrawal agreement, everyone and his wife said that that was impossible. Indeed, the EU had repeatedly said that they would never do any such thing. Nevertheless, the Prime Minister did persuade them to do exactly that, and to amend the political declaration to boot, and he managed to do all of that in under 3 months. And I think you have to give credit where credit is due. Fourthly, the EU itself now has strong reasons to accept a deal. The one thing that really worries the European Commission in particular, but many of the member states as well, is the prospect of the United Kingdom becoming the Singapore of Europe. As such, with an Anglo-Saxon economic model which is far more flexible than theirs, they've also always been worried that we would undercut them in world markets. That's one of the reasons why they were so desperate to keep us locked in the European Union in the first place. It's become clear that regulatory divergence has already become a sticking point in the early negotiations. We are not going to become an economy with low standards. It is, however, completely within the realms of possibility that we will want to introduce legislation in the future that has similar or even better standards than our friends across the Channel, but which would be particularly bespoke for the United Kingdom. That's our right to elect our own government and make our own laws. That being the case, frankly, the European Union's next best alternative is to sign some kind of agreement with us in order to try and prevent us from outcompeting them entirely. They therefore now have a very strong incentive to reach an agreement which didn't exist when they hoped and believed, encouraged by some in Parliament, most of whom are no longer with us, that we would still remain in the EU. They were stringing it out in the hope that somehow there'd be an inconclusive result, there'd be a second referendum and so on. It wasn't. So now that the Prime Minister's stated determination to opt for an Australian-style deal, based essentially on World Trade Organisation WTO rules, now that he's said that very clearly, if the EU will not accept a Canadian-style version, the PM's commitment should only serve to concentrate minds in Brussels. Indeed, this view was echoed by our chief negotiator, David Frost, who said during an excellent speech recently in Brussels the follows. He said, I quote, "We are ready to trade on Australia-style terms if we can't agree a Canada-type FTA. We understand the trade-offs involved. People sometimes say we don't, but we do." It's important to remember the British people voted democratically to leave twice, to regain our sovereignty, to regain our ability to regulate and legislate for ourselves, to regain the power of our courts, and the EU are now finally waking up to this new reality. Suddenly they want to come and talk to us. I had an absolutely charming French senator come to see me a fortnight ago. For some reason, for the last 3 years, I was of no interest to them. But this chap turned up. He was absolutely charming. He said, "Mr. Francois, you have a French name." "Have your family spent much time in France?" I said, "Well, sir, my father was at Normandy once, if that helps you." Now, a number of people have expressed interest recently about the future of the European Research Group, which I have the honour now to chair. And I see my great friend and colleague Julian Lewis, who's a member of the ERG and was an excellent chairman of the Defence Select Committee to boot, in the audience here. You might like to know that at our recent annual general meeting we discussed at some length the future of the ERG, And the unanimous view of the group was that the ERG should not be disbanded or dissolved, even despite the victory over Brexit, not least because we have an important role to play in monitoring the trade negotiations that I've just been speaking about. Also, incidentally, a considerable number of the 2019 intake are Eurosceptic-minded, and you might like to know that we have been recruiting very healthily among the new crop of Conservative MPs, who I'm glad to report are absolutely determined to keep their promises to the British electorate. So, in the event of some Chequers-style aberration emerging from the negotiations, we do therefore have the numbers to intervene decisively, should we have to. Or as someone put it at the end of our AGM, our posture should be, quotes, that the submarine remains at sea. But I must stress that we do have confidence in the Prime Minister to negotiate an equitable deal that will protect our sovereignty as an independent nation, exactly as he outlined in his excellent speech at Greenwich, where he said the following: "There is no need for a free trade agreement to involve accepting EU rules on competition policy, subsidies, social protection, the environment, or anything similar, any more than the EU should be obliged to accept UK rules. The UK will maintain the highest standards in these areas, better in many respects than those of the EU, without the compulsion of a treaty." For good measure, he then went on to say, "I stress this need for full legal autonomy. The reason we do not seek membership or part membership of the customs union or alignment of any kind is at least partly that I want this country to be an independent actor and catalyst for free trade across the world." Now, Theresa May once made an excellent speech at Lancaster House, but unfortunately she didn't stick to it. In the view of the ERG, this Prime Minister is highly likely to stick to his commitments in the Greenwich speech, and therefore we are considerably reassured. But we remain vigilant, just in case. After all, we did not do all this work to win the war, to lose the peace. So in summary, Mr. Chairman, there's still a way to go until a free trade agreement has been agreed. But I do believe that it is more than possible to reach a fair and equitable deal with the European Union, exactly as I believe it is also possible to reach an equally fair deal with the United States. Now we have a president who wants us to put us at the front of the queue rather than at the back. One of the great advantages of leaving the European Union is we can strike trade deals with countries around the world and prosper economically as a result. These are exciting times for what Andrew referred to as global Britain, and I very much look forward to our signing a fair and equitable free trade agreement with our European partners before the end of the year. Isn't it marvellous to live in a free country? Thank you very much.